Uh, this audience may not be aware of the caregiver situation. I mean, it's really the hot topic in the cannabis industry, but this is the business and technology folks. And they may not be aware that there's a big move underway by the very large cannabis companies. Well, we won't name them, but we will name their organization, Michigan Cannabis Manufacturers Association. And they probably represent 60 or 70% of the provisioning centers out there, I would imagine, to some number in that ballpark. And Rick came out of the caregiver background. And of course, there's this big controversy where they're trying to make bunches of changes to the caregivers legislation. But you can explain it much better than I, Rick. So run with that ball.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. First of all, for our listeners and our viewers, NORML is the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. I'm the executive director of the Michigan chapter. Been on the board of directors for about, 5-6 years prior to being added as the executive director just recently. In Michigan, we have a medical marijuana program. We have a medical marijuana business program, and then we also have an adult use cannabis program. In the original medical marijuana program, there are patients, and then there are people who are assigned the duty of growing plants on behalf of a patient who may be in a living situation that doesn't allow them to grow plants for themselves. Those people are called caregivers. They're allowed to grow 12 plants on behalf of each individual patient that they assist. And a caregiver is allowed to assist up to 5 patients at any given time. And that's how it's been since 2008, with no changes. Now, just this year, 2021, the Michigan Cannabis Manufacturers Association has inspired lawmakers to introduce legislation that would radically change that relationship between patient and caregiver, and also the way that caregivers interact with the marijuana regulatory agency and with local law enforcement. It would also change our Section 8 defense, which is a defense allowing you to explain to a court why you may need more than 12 cannabis plants in order to satisfy your medical needs, which has been used hundreds of times in Michigan's history. And it also changes the way that we manufacture specialty medicines called concentrates, which are the most effective way in order to treat certain conditions. Just to make all of our viewers aware, in Michigan, there are about 300 children who've been assigned the ability to use cannabis in order to treat illnesses, traditionally Dravet syndrome, some of the tremor-related things, multiple sclerosis. So those 300 children are required by law to have a caregiver assigned to them. So anytime you propose to change laws for caregivers, you're actually changing the laws that govern how sick children receive their medicine. So the Michigan Cannabis Manufacturers Association is a trade group which represents, according to them, about half of the cannabis plants under cultivation in the state of Michigan right now on the regulated market. They are primarily a cultivators organization, although some of those organizations are vertically integrated. That means that they have the ability to cultivate, process, and retail sell cannabis, as opposed to having a license to do only just one of those 3 things. So in that instance, the Michigan Cannabis Manufacturers Association does own a significant part of the state's cannabis industry. They are concerned that they would be able to get additional market share, additional cannabis sales, if caregivers were able to service fewer patients or no patients at all. Their original proposal was to allow caregivers to only have 1 patient instead of 5. That was completely distasteful. Now they've adjusted it to say, well, you can still have 5 patients, but you can still only have 12 plants, which is also completely not acceptable. The alterations in the way that we produce concentrated medicines, it involves using a chemical, which is called a solvent, which helps to strip the THC-bearing nodules called trichomes from the organic material of the plant. It's important because we really don't need the organic material. We only need those rich nodules of juice. They would propose a change that would take away the ability for patients and caregivers alike to be able to produce these on their own, which means that those substances would only be available in retail stores. So when we look at the totality of what proposed changes exist, they really are specifically to benefit business at the expense of the sick people in Michigan whose lives have been consistently assisted for 12 years with this program and really have no history of bad behavior to justify making changes. So when we look at the legislation that's out there, that's essentially what it does and who crafted it. Now, the status of the legislation is on hold right now, and that's due in part to a great response from Michigan's patient and caregiver community, and also from regulated licensed businesses who support them as well. We talked about the Michigan Cannabis Manufacturers Association. They only have about 12 members. It's very secretive, very mysterious. They don't tell you who's in the organization, but it's always been a small cabal of the ultra wealthy people in the industry. Compare that to the Michigan Cannabis Industry Association, which is a 300+ member organization, which is composed also of some of the biggest companies, but also a lot of the small ones too. And even ancillary industry companies can become a member of the Michigan Cannabis Industry Association. The MCIA has universally rejected these bills as being bad for business and bad for the state of Michigan. So when you look at an industry perspective, you see two primary trade organizations, one that insists on these changes, one that opposes these changes. So there is no uniformity of opinion when it comes to Michigan regulated businesses regarding the need to change the laws to disadvantage caregivers in order to advantage business.
So Rick, what is their justification for these changes? Why do they say these changes are a good idea?
Well, you can find examples of caregivers not behaving well in some municipalities. Sometimes a cultivation operation will be smelly and neighbors will complain. Sometimes they have a lot of traffic and neighbors will complain. So you're seeing municipal officials reaching out to local lawmakers to say, we have these problems in our community and we need a solution for those, because the prosecutor in our county no longer wants to prosecute those crimes. So we don't have any tools to be able to deal with them. Now, Matt, the problem is that with legislation on a statewide level, you can't dictate zoning. You cannot handle municipal issues like this on a state level. Those are up to each individual municipality to resolve. It's illegal to try and craft zoning regulations through state legislative action. We've already learned that in the medical marijuana history back in their 12 years. So what we're seeing is frustration on the part of municipal officials, which has been capitalized upon by a trade group who's trying to get concessions from the industry in order to create what they believe will be a financial benefit for themselves, which would be going from 72,000 patients using caregivers down to only about 30,000 patients using caregivers. So they perceive that 42,000 patient bonus will all purchase from the retail stores, and that would directly benefit them. I would counter by saying that if you unwillingly strip a caregiver away from a patient, there's no way in hell those people will ever patronize your businesses. You will never get $1 of their money if you are the reason why they no longer have a relationship that benefited them for 12 years. So it's a false promise and it's a bad chase. And it's the wrong tool to solve the problem, Matt. And really, that's what we're looking at.
The other thing, too, is they're saying that the caregiver stuff is not tested, that therefore it's not good for these patients. And Abco Labs is one of our sponsors on my other show. When I brought that up with them, and they go, no, we get that stuff in here all the time. People are always testing it. So
Amy Brown from Abco was just on social media saying exactly the same thing. Caregivers do a lot of testing, and caregivers have some pretty clean cannabis. But the fact is, whether or not you have a test result, the true measure of whether or not something's not good is based on the consumer experience. If we've been consuming cannabis that comes from the same source for 20 years and we've had no deficit or no problems, I think it's fair to assume probably is no problem with that. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. If there was a health emergency that required the attention of the Michigan Department of Department of Health and Human Services, like we saw with spice and K2 and bath salts. Remember, when those things came out on the market, there was demonstrable harm. It was immediate. You could absolutely see it right away. And it was addressed by local communities, by prosecutors, and by the legislature in a way that we all approved and appreciated. So I'm not anti-regulation. I'm anti, assumption. If we want to assume that cannabis that's not tested is causing harm, let's show the numbers. Let's see some appreciation. I mean, we have at this particular time 30,000 caregivers producing cannabis right now with no demonstrated medical need, but go further than that, 250,000 patients who all have the ability to grow 12 plants, no medical problems. Go beyond that. There are 7 million adults who now have the ability to grow 12 plants in their home if they choose to, and still no medical problems. I would submit, based on that evidence, until you show me a medical problem, there isn't one.
Okay.
Yeah, and then that's obviously your biggest legislative priority, but we still got 4 or 5 minutes left here before we bring in Thomas Vaughn. So what would you say are some of your other top legislative priorities?
Well, of course, we want to encourage our federal government to do smart legalization of cannabis. And we think that the smartest way to do that is just to decriminalize. I don't think we need federal infrastructure established at this particular point when all 50 states don't have an equitable level of approval for cannabis use or cannabis commerce. It would be wrong to impose a Michigan-style law situation on Utah or Nevada, which has its own individual system, which probably thinks it's superior to Michigan's. So in the absence of having one national model that everyone's following, it seems wrong to try and enforce things like interstate commerce onto states where they don't want cannabis in there, or where they'd like to protect their individual businesses and not allow Oregon's 2-year oversupply of moldy old cannabis to be flooded into the Michigan market and undercut all of those new businesses trying to get started.
Yeah. And certainly it's 19 states have adult use legal now. Something in the neighborhood of 42, 43 have medical marijuana. Our neighbors to the south in Indiana have neither. And we had a story last week we were looking at where a lot of Hoosiers are crossing the state line to come over to these just across the state border where all those Michigan dispensaries are. And 60% of their revenue is coming from Indiana.
Yeah, I think that's a success story. What it shows is reciprocity has been a big part of our program since 2008. Reciprocity is the permission that allows medical patients from other states to come and use our medical program. It also allows adults from other states to come and use our adult use program. Not all states participate in reciprocity, and some do it in a different way. If you visit Hawaii with a Michigan medical license, you'll have to receive a temporary medical permit in order to be able to utilize their medical marijuana facilities there. Same thing with California as well. So here in Michigan, we have an easy peasy kind of a program. Not every place does.